And the Hangout on Air is now live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking About Stuff. I'm Christiana Ellis.
And I'm Mike Mateen.
And here is where my instinct is to say which episode of Survivor we're talking about, but that's not what's happening here. We're not talking about a movie or either. It's just one of the talking about stuff.
Talking about stuff. Let's see. When does Survivor start? Do we know?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's probably in, I would guess September. Well, let's see. We can probably find out pretty quickly. Premiere. Gesundheit.
This is the Millennials versus Gen X, right?
Yes. September 21st is when the new season premieres. Wednesday, September 21st. Yeah, so I am, as we talked about in our last Survivor finale.
And we have the full cast list, so.
Yes. I'm not into the theme. That's been one of my internet pet peeves lately is all of the, the millennials stuff. I don't know. I just resent the whole idea of just something about the whole idea that you can categorize an entire generation of people as though they're all the same. Just feels like it's might as well be the horoscope or something. I mean, There's something to it in the sense that people, like, there's general demographic trends and that sort of thing, but I don't like the way people use it. The idea of, millennials are ruining the housing market, or millennials are driving down the golf business, or millennials just don't know how to interact with people, that sort of thing. You know what I mean? It's just...
Right.
It's gross. I don't care for it.
Yeah, there's a misattribution to it, where I think it is useful in describing, like, for example, millennials have spent their majority of their lives, for most of them, growing up with access to a personal computer or smartphone and the ability to Google whatever they want whenever they want. Like, that there is a trait to that, their expectations on how information is delivered and communicated to them because of that piece of their lives that isn't the same as the generation before them. That is an accurate reason to attribute a generational tag to them. So when you are talking about things like when you're trying to communicate with that group and you're talking about the style in which you have to communicate because of what they are used to as a generation, that's accurate. When you say just young people are not good for the housing market, basically, and you call them millennials instead of just saying young people, that's when it's a misattribution. When really you're just saying 25-year-olds aren't good for this,
Well, see, the reason...
generational trait.
Yeah. I mean, see, I think you hit on it exactly. The reason that it's all about, quote, millennials instead of young people is so that they don't sound like they're just these darn kids today.
Right.
I mean, because that's what they're saying, really.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's what ultimately feels like it's at the heart of it is that, it's like that old classic quote that's talking about kids today don't respect their elders, and there's some other pieces to it too. And then it's a quote from Plato or something like that. And just like I remember there's a song in Bye Bye Birdie, a musical from I think the 60s, that is all about, kids today, and they don't want to work, and they don't know how to respect their elders, and all that sort of stuff. And I just feel like it's like this is the exact same stuff that every generation says about the next one. And it's not new. It is just older people complaining about younger people. And while I'm not going to say there's nothing else to it, because there are societal trends, but at the same time, let's talk about that instead of implying that somehow the young kids are responsible for how they were raised in the society that they're growing up in.
Right.
Gosh, I got more heated about that than I expected.
Hey, that's our first stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's like I said, it was just sort of a pet peeve recently. I've actually had a couple of recently just kind of sarcastic clickbaity quotes because okay, I tweeted something the other day that was like a headline. It was struggling housing market due to people blaming millennials for everything. Had another one that was kind of like that recently, and I can't remember it now. But yeah, I think that's just something that's been sticking in my craw, so to speak, recently. Because I know the other element was one of the sort of new cliches about millennials is the whole participation trophy thing.
Oh, yeah.
As though that's somehow new. They did participation trophies and ribbons and stuff when we were kids. It wasn't new then.
No, it wasn't. But technically, you and I are on the borderline of being millennials.
That's true.
We're the very, very end of Gen X, very start of millennials. So
yeah,
that's why.
All the more reason though that yeah, it's just it's all the more reason that like the whole thing is dumb because people don't come in batches like that. You know what I mean? It's not like millennials are a group. It's, depending on your definition, it could be anyone. Like, if we're on one end of it, then it could be people like, when does the next generation start? Like, are kids, like babies born today, are they going to be millennials or are they going to be the next thing?
I think actually like kids in like about to go into college right now are technically not millennials by the definition. Yeah, I think millennials all have graduated college at this point. I don't even know what that next generation is called though.
See, all of this is a perfect example of why it's all nonsense and it irritates me.
The generation is supposed to be like 20 years.
Yeah.
If we're the start of it in the late 70s, then it's kids born in the late 90s should be the end of it.
Yeah. See, I feel like the only generation I can think of where it really makes any kind of sense to think of them as any kind of a group is when you talk about baby boomers, because that was responding to a specific global situation, like you had coming out of the war and then this era of, prosperity coming out of it where there were lots of babies. And like, you can sort of say that is a sort of a big, huge trend that led to a specific thing. And even then, it still doesn't tell you anything about individual people, but it's more of a thing. Whereas I feel like every generation since then has just been about, well, okay, if we want to just randomly assign this year to this year, and what are people born in that time period like? And then let's put a name on it.
Well, and the Gen X is sort of what prompted that, because like you said, the baby boomers there was a theme behind that. Mm-hmm. And then it was that's why Gen X is Gen X, because it was the next generation and it had no defining characteristic. Yeah. So that's it. Its lack of definition is why it's Gen X. Mm-hmm. And then they were sillily calling the next generation Gen Y.
Yeah.
Which only made sense because it came after Gen X, but like Gen X was the whole point was that X was like to be determined later, but then it never actually got determined. So I'm glad they at least changed Gen Y to millennials, except now they're calling the next Gen Z, or maybe sometimes you hear it called I generation. It's, and that's all the kids born in the 2000s. So
yeah,
like if you're 16, 17, 18 right now, you're not a millennial. You're a Gen Z or I generation or whatever they're going to end up calling it. So,
yeah, I mean, I think I'm just repeating myself at this point, but I think what ultimately that bothers me about the whole thing is really just that it feels like all a mask for older people to complain about younger people, which is nothing new or particularly unique to millennials.
Yes, it typically is that. It is used that way, even if there is a realistic reason why it exists. It is often, going back to what my first statement is, it's often misappropriated to exactly what you just said.
Mm-hmm. So in any case,
about Gen Xers. Gen Xers were just like, you know, they didn't know what they wanted to do, and they just, you know, they didn't have any drive. You know, baby boomers worked hard, and baby boomers, you know, because they came out of that depression, and they were born of parents of the depression, so they knew the value of hard work and family life. And Gen Xers were just like, yeah, we have everything. We have no war, so we're just going to, like, chill. Now millennials are, you know, they just want everything delivered to them, and they want to win a participation trophy. And the Gen Xers are so upset about that. You know?
Yeah.
You're right. And that's the thing is, like, I'm being facetious here. It's really just old people complaining about young people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So all the more reason that it's just such a buzzword that's just that's why, you know, not that Survivor has ever been immune to that sort of thing, but I guess this just felt like such a like cash in, like clickbaity sort of thing. It's one thing if they wanted to say it was, you know, experience versus youth or something like that. I almost would have been more okay with that, even if the teams were the same. But just putting the labels on it bugs me.
Yeah, that's a marketing viewership thing, though.
Well, of course it is. That doesn't mean I have to not be irritated by it.
Yes, remain irritated, you grumpy Gen Xer.
I deserve it. I worked hard to get here. Anyway. So, what else is going on? What's new with you? What sort of stuff would you like to talk about?
I mean, I feel like we can't. Speaking of just like clickbaity things, we've got to discuss the Pokemon Go.
Oh, sure.
Because it's just such a phenomenon.
It's kind of incredible how big that got. It's pretty amazing, actually. I mean, I think I read somewhere that they believe that the user activity has already peaked, but it got so high that it's still going to be a substantial amount of people using it for a long time, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, they were having more active daily users than like Twitter.
Yeah.
You know, and that's an important distinction. By the way, I got into a discussion with colleagues about this. It's more active daily users. They don't have more physical people in the platform.
Mm-hmm.
They have more people actively using it, you know, and that's a big distinction because there are definitely more Twitter users.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't daily activate. That's the whole point, though, is that the Pokemon thing is not. It's not just about people weren't just signing up for it. People were actually actively using it frequently.
Yeah.
And it's kind of amazing.
Well, it is. I think that it just managed to capture, like, it has some, like, as a game or as an app, I think it has some really substantial problems that would hinder it if it didn't have so many other things going for it. But somehow what it is just managed to capture this element of being easy to incorporate into what other people are already doing, into what people are already doing with their phone, but adding this extra layer onto it that's enough fun that they want to keep doing that. So it's easy to start doing it because you've already got your phone with you all the time, and if you're just standing on the street corner for a second, you say, "Oh, let's see what if there are any Pokemon around here." But then once you're in, it has these different elements of like, oh, look, there's a different one over there, so let's go over there, and then what's there, and you know, just all the little pieces of it added up to something kind of amazing.
Well, yeah, and like the fact that, you know, if you walk 5 kilometers, you can hatch an egg.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so now there's an incentive to continue to leave the app open while you're moving around and like hunt for Pokemons, you know. And the Pokemons themselves are kind of a cool. Obviously, that's been a thing that, you know,
that's a proven.
That's a, you know, it's been around for a while.
The whole gotta collect them all thing is just built into the whole thing. Just so in case anybody was wondering about my own cred, There's level 20. Yeah, so I've not actually been playing the game. Like, I've never been doing anything or going anywhere in order to play the game. However, when I do things like walking Luna, or when I'm walking to,
I'm just level 10.
Oh, well, hey, you got to start somewhere.
Yep.
I see you're a team, one of those Team Red, Team Valor.
Yes. Yeah. I didn't really know which one to pick, so I just chose one.
Well, honestly, I mean, obviously it doesn't really matter. But that does remind me of a funny meme I saw the other day, which was someone had digitally recolored a Coke can. So instead of the red part of the can, it was aqua colored. And this was presented at first without context. It was one of those Tumblr posts where you see the kind of nested responses.
Right.
And so it started with just a picture, and then someone was saying, something about this just really speaks to me. It's like it's more calming, more relaxing. I feel like I'm more interested in buying it when the can is this color. Was that weird? And then someone else just says, enough with this Team Mystic propaganda. And Team Mystic is the blue team, so the idea is like you change the red can to a blue can and that makes it better. Anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, so just what I've been doing. Just another thing that's relevant there is that since I started my new client project, for work, since the beginning of July, my commute has been by bus and subway rather than driving, because I, would have to pay $18 a day for parking if I were to drive. So not going to do that. Nope. But that just means that there has been extra commute time where I can safely play in doing something that I would be doing anyway, and taking it with me while I'm walking Luna or something like that. So I have not ever been doing something in order to play it or going somewhere in order to play it, but there's lots of times where I'm playing it while I do whatever I was going to be doing anyway, and that's what I've gotten me my level 20.
Well, there is that, and the funny thing about it is there are some people where it has prompted them.
Sure.
And that's sort of the joke, is that like Pokemon Go has done more for childhood obesity than the experts could have been able to do in 20 years. Because it just got kids to go outside.
Well, I mean, and I don't want to dismiss that element of it at all, but I think there's some hyperbole element there too, because
for sure. But yeah, I have seen it. I mean, I've walked Mowgli at the park, and I've seen, little pale chubby kids running around, and it's like you can tell that that's not a thing they normally would do, and yet they're running through the park and they're catching their Pokemons, and their mom or their older sisters or whatever are watching them and taking them. And it's kind of cool when you see that, because you're like, okay, yeah, like you get to play a video game, which you obviously like to do, but you're running around outside, and which you should also like to do,
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of hyperbole, but there's a little bit of truth behind it, as with any hyperbole,
Sure. Yeah, no, exactly. I agree 100%. It's a fascinating phenomenon is what it is, just because I think, even when they had announced what it was going to be, people said, boy, that seems like if they can do it well, then it'll be really popular. But then I think it took off like a rocket, and I don't think anybody anticipated how popular it was going to get. You see some of these photos. I don't know if there's been any examples quite as extreme as this in the States, but in some of these other countries where maybe they have like fewer total landmarks in the system or something like that, but you see some of these photos that are just like these crowds of people just looking like they're, in a standing room only concert or something, and they're just flocking through parks like a school of fish going after Pokemon.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing. I think that there's just some, like I was saying, there's some sort of magic combination some chemistry that they managed to tap into where it's easy, but has that sort of built-in, I've done it a little bit and that makes me want to do it more element.
Yeah, it definitely has a reward system in place too. Like you know, the progressively like, you know, the sort of the little dopamine drip of like, oh, I just caught that Pokemon, which I didn't have before. I want to keep finding new Pokemons. And oh man, I just hatched that egg and a really cool thing came out. I want to keep walking around with new eggs. Like there's that constant, like there's a constant progression. They've really hit the linear, you know, piece to it, you know?
Yeah, so, yeah. And it's
the reward system. Yeah.
It's impressive. Now, like as soon as it was, you know, really big, I was kind of just thinking to myself, well, okay, obviously it's a fad, but that doesn't, I don't feel like calling it a fad really diminishes what it is. I think I just mean it's a fad as opposed to a transformation of society, but it's still kind of a runaway incredible success that I am sure is going to spawn 1,000 clones of itself. And, you know, just any company that can hack together a reasonably functional GPS system to lay onto like what the phone is already doing. Like I've heard half a dozen different versions of Pokemon Go, just reskinning the game essentially. That you could have like a Ghostbusters one where the AR is like, oh, you can see the ghost through the phone, and then you have to catch and trap the ghost, that sort of thing, right? So just
Harry Potter as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just it's like you said, it's reskinning the game just based on what other people, you know, what other interests people might have.
Yeah,
I don't know if none of those will be as successful. I mean, there's just something for being the groundbreaker. It's like I said, it's pretty impressive the how it's kind of come together. And
yeah.
I had a really funny conversation with somebody at work who was talking about it, and they were like, "Yeah, I mean, people are playing all over the place, and you know, I was at the grocery store," and they were all like, you know, in a huff. They're like, "I was at a grocery store, you know, I'm reading my emails, and I hear this mom say, 'Oh, look, honey, see, she's playing Pokemon Go too.'" And I was like, "I'm not playing Pokemon. I'm reading emails." And it's like, are you really that much better? You're still staring at your phone.
Yeah.
Like she was trying to make it sound like, oh, like just staring mindlessly into your phone for Pokemons is a bad thing. But, you know, I'm going to stare mindlessly in my phone to read email. Like, no, it's exactly the same. Like, and that's why I think it's funny when you talk about, like, you're doing things that people are already doing anyway. People already stare at their phone when they're walking around. Mm-hmm. This just happened to give them something that wasn't their email or wasn't Facebook, you know, that they actually have to, like, engage with, and wasn't just, it's actually less mindless because you actively participate.
Mm-hmm. You know? Well, you know, that just reminds me of there's a book called Everything Bad is Good for You, and I think it's probably like 10 plus years old now by now.
I think we probably talked about it on this show.
I know that we have, but just the reason I think about it is just keyed into what you said. That sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but you're right that we have talked about it before. But one of the things that it was commenting on specifically is with video games, one of the things that is a common complaint from parents who don't understand what kids are really doing when they're playing games is that you see them just staring at the screen, apparently passive. Maybe their face looks kind of slack, and the feeling of like, oh, well, that's somehow this like brain rotting activity. And the book was kind of like, well, what do you think your face looks like when you're reading a book? It's not slack. It's just internal. You know, so like a video game is all about a system. It's about being presented with a tool to manipulate the system, which is the controller, and being presented with experimental feedback and having to learn the rules of the system. And that's you know, that's not every game is necessarily as good as every other game from the perspective of being educational or forming skills, but just the idea that, oh, you can tell it's like their face looks slack while they're playing, it's like that doesn't mean anything. It just means they're concentrating.
Right. Yeah, that's a good. that's a good point. But yeah, I did kind of find that amusing because I would have the same. I've had the same criticism of people, and it's just like, are you really just like that in like, because email works the same way for some people. There's a constant feed of it. It means like, oh, I'm receiving this could be the information that I need to transform my life, or it's just it's just something new and different than what I'm doing right now. And that bing, 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 that drip feed is similar, And so
for sure. Checking to see if you got any likes on Facebook or little hearts on Instagram or whatever. The idea that you're not only interested in how many people like it, but preoccupied enough with it that lots of times people will be bringing out their phone 2-3 times a minute sometimes to check any new ones. It's kind of it is like you were saying, it's that sort of drip feed of trying to get attention and validation via little digital feedback. And I think there's also just an element of anytime something is really popular, there's going to be an instinct among people who are not interested in it to want to diminish it as though to justify their own lack of interest. You know what I mean? Like
Abby and I watched Titanic last night, so
yeah.
There's another great example. Phenomenal movie. A lot of people took a lot of shots at small things that were, wrong with it or bothered them, But it's a great, so I'm very familiar.
Well, part of the reason I laughed about that specific example is that last night I watched the episode of Futurama that made fun of Titanic. So it was kind of a fun coincidence there. But yeah, I think that's a good example, is that anytime we're always driven by these two instincts. One is to belong to a group and be accepted within that group, and the other is to want to be an individual and not be conformist, right? And I think everybody has those two drives in them all the time. And your behavior wobbles back and forth over which one of those you're kind of following at the moment. But people might have different balances, but I think both are always there. And so I think there's an element where if something that you're not necessarily into starts getting really popular, there can be a tendency to want to say, well, I'm obviously not in that group, therefore I'm going to make sure everybody knows I'm in the other group. I don't know if that's really what's going on. But the point of wanting to trash something that lots of other people like, the backlash effect, is... I bet part of what that gets at is this whole idea that it's very easy to come up with, and maybe it's always been true, but this idea that there's no nuance, right? Everything is either great or it's terrible. And a good example of that is the Suicide Squad movie, which I haven't actually seen, but just the idea that a lot of critics didn't like it, and that inspired a lot of people to probably be over-enthusiastic in their praises of it in order to defend against an unfair attack. You know what I mean? I
know what you mean in theory. I apparently am not reading the right things, because I have only seen blanket disapproval of the movie. And maybe not all of it's as bad as like the critical review, but there's, I think everybody I know was let down based on the promise.
Yeah.
I've not seen I've seen zero praise for it, but I'm not saying that it doesn't exist.
Well, what I've seen is people going and saying, I don't know what everyone's complaining about. It's fine. Whereas it may well be that if everybody else was saying they loved it, then that person would be more inclined to point out whatever criticisms they may have. But when they want to like it against the tide of everybody else not liking it, it triggers this defensive streak. And I haven't seen it, so I mean, I can't comment on it specifically. But I guess it's just this idea that something has to be amazing, or else that means it's terrible. And the way that also can manifest is when maybe something is really good, but does have some problematic element of it. Something that you don't like about it, something that's not perfect, even among the rest of it being really good. And there can be this tendency of, if you want to say it's good, then you're not allowed to say anything bad about it. And if you want to say it's bad, then you can't say anything good about it. And there's a general intolerance among the group mind of a nuanced portrayal of something.
Right. And that's why I try not to participate in those kind of discussions, because I would rather speak one-on-one and have nuanced discussions, which everyone is capable of doing. Like you're exactly right. It's that group think that causes people to act like that. When individually they may say that, like you may take one of those people who's rallying for Suicide Squad, and you have a conversation one-on-one like this or over a beer, and they're going to say, yeah, I mean, I liked it. These things were a problem, but overall I didn't mind them because I liked this about it. Yeah. They're not going to say that when they're trying to fit into that groupthink, you know?
Yeah. And I think that's something everybody is prone to. I know, for example, that there have been times where I've had to fight against a tendency where if I really like something and then someone else didn't like it, there can be an instinct to interpret that as a personal attack.
Right.
When it's really not. But at the same time, the etiquette around that sort of thing is interesting, and this ties into the internet too. Like, so for example, something that kind of surprised me the other day was, this wasn't that recently, but okay, I'm not going to get into the specifics of it just because I still have regular communication with the people involved. I don't want to get into it.
Okay.
But the short version of the story is that there's a thing that I really like and feel is underrated. And I had read an article where someone else was also saying that they felt it was underrated, and I thought that they explained the position that I shared really well. So I shared that link and was saying, it's great to see someone else also likes this. And so a handful of people chimed in to agree, but then one person just comments, it was pretty bad. And I was just thinking, what sort of response were they hoping for exactly there? I mean, I didn't ask everybody's opinion. What do you think of this? This was me saying, I like this thing. Here is another person who says they like it. And it would be one thing if the person was saying, well, I'm glad you liked it, but it had these elements that just didn't work for me. But the idea of
about the particular thing that you're talking about, by the way.
Did you see the post in question, or you're guessing?
No, I'm familiar with it. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Oh, okay. Did we talk about this already privately or something? Maybe on a Hey, Want to Watch a Movie or something.
I think you were. I think privately we were talking, and you were espousing your love for this particular movie.
Yeah.
And I had also seen the conversation, and so you were talking about how, like, what? Yeah. So yes, we've talked.
You can see it's still under my skin. But I guess just the idea,
which is fair because it was an unnecessary comment. Because, like I said, I feel the way that you just described. The movie didn't work because of certain elements, but I'm just going to ignore. If you're going to go and share and say, hey, this is something that I like, and here's another critic who thinks that this was underrated, and I could say, you know what, I don't agree, but I respect your opinion. I'm not going to comment. I'm not going to go online and take my time to point that out. There's no value in that for me.
Right. And that's kind of what I was getting at too, is that there's this, it's that if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all element, which just is like manners. Now, at the same time,
I don't blanketly dislike the movie. I don't like it as much as you do. So
it's even fair if someone just really didn't like it at all. I mean, they're entitled to that opinion, and I would disagree. It's a subjective assessment, right?
True.
But I guess the idea is, do you think that simply posting an opinion, I guess this is maybe the broader question. If you have an opinion and you post about your opinion on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and especially when it's a positive opinion, you are asserting that you like something. You're not complaining about something else. You're saying, I like this. Do you think of that as
charged either, you know? Like I could see
right, yeah.
It's not political. It's not something that's like highly emotionally charged. Like if you went on and posted, I love, at this point, X or Y political candidate, you could see why someone might be wanting to publicly disagree with you.
Right.
But when you're talking about something that's just an opinion of a popular culture thing, like a movie or a book or a video. Right. So continue.
Yeah. So the question then becomes, is simply stating an opinion on the internet now obviously people are able to chime in with whatever they think about it, right? But when I'm posting something on Twitter, I'm usually thinking of it in the context of, I am talking to the people who follow me on Twitter, and I'm telling them something about myself, which is not necessarily the same as inviting a discussion. Now, that's not to say I want to be immune from people proposing opposing viewpoints, but I feel like there should be an expectation that that's not the given. So if someone wants to get into a discussion, that's like an extra step to initiate that. It's not already opened unless I have invited it. That tends to be how I think about it. Now, of course, nothing stops someone from chiming in.
Right. They have the ability to. And I would say, truly, if they shouldn't really respond with an opinion unless you posted, hey, here's this cool thing about this movie that this critic said that I also agree this was an underrated movie. What are all your thoughts? Like, that would be the proper etiquette of the discussion. I would parse it a little bit, though, and say that I think on Twitter you're more likely, like, that online venue is more for discussion. Than, like, Facebook's not really about discussing anything. It's really just about sugarcoating your life for your friends. So they that's not a bad thing. Like, that's kind of what it's like. It's like, here are the things I'm doing. I'm keeping you up to date with the fun things that are happening, or the bad things if I want to be that person on Facebook. But the things I want people to know about me, I am friends of mine, I am sharing. And I feel like and that's why they're called comments. It's not called discussion. It's called comment. Because Facebook is really like, here's me at the beach. And it's like, oh, that's so cool that you're at the beach. I went to the beach last week. And, like, that's all it's all it's meant for. Twitter is a little bit more of an expectation of that is a venue for discussion. However, like you said, ideally, you would invite that discussion in your original comment.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the only thing I would parse a little bit from what you were saying. The general principle.
Well, maybe it just comes back down to the manners element for me, which is if someone has expressed a like of something, a preference of something, then you, this is abstract, could agree to that and jump in, and that would be completely fine. If you disagree, it's kind of aggressive to offer that without it having been solicited. And it's
right, and that's why I point out that that's more likely to happen on Twitter, because that is what people do that more often on Twitter.
Yeah, people will just search for something they don't like to find anyone who has ever talked about it, whether you follow them or not.
Right, and just even think about the little semantic differences. Like on Twitter, they are your follower. They're people who are following what you have to say. They're not necessarily on Facebook. They're your friends. Like they're supposed to be your friends. Like, these are supposed to be people and there's a like button, and all of the emotions on there are all, they're not all positive now because they have like the I'm sad or whatever. But there's not like an angry one at you.
Right. It's like, not I dislike this. I am right. You suck.
All of the emotions are somehow supportive of what you put on there.
Right.
So if you put on something that makes you angry, then someone else can say, I am also angry.
Right.
You know, if you put something that's sad, they can say, oh, that makes me sad for you. But they're all about what you put on. They're all about supporting you. That's how Facebook is set up. So it is weird, especially on Facebook, when someone comes aggressively at something, because that's not really what that venue is meant for.
Right. And I think what happened in this particular case, and what is very common online in general, is just people get so used to putting their thoughts and feelings out there, and I'm certainly not immune to that element, but there can sometimes, with those sorts of online communications, be a lack of consideration as to who's going to hear it and like how they might feel about it. So in this context, I think the person who left the comment, probably it never even crossed their mind to consider how I would feel about what they said. I introduced a topic and they expressed their opinion on it. And that's all there was to it. And the idea that they were participating in a conversation with me never even crossed their mind.
Mm-hmm.
It was really almost just like they had come across some random internet survey that said, hey, what do you think of X? And so even though it was leaving a comment on my post, I don't think it crossed their mind to say, well, let me think about what I'm going to say here and how Christiana might feel about it. Now, I'm not saying everybody has to tiptoe around me necessarily, but I think in this case, they weren't trying to hurt my feelings, but they also really just didn't even think about it. And I think we can all have that tendency sometimes.
Yeah, it feels like that's more of what hurt your feelings. Wasn't that they disagreed with you. It was that they had no consideration. Like there was just sort of a lack of consideration about what they were posting. Like on a discussion that was mostly positive, that the other people were supporting you, people who might have disagreed with you, you know, just didn't say anything. That's why me. I didn't say anything. I read it. You told me about it in person. I don't agree that movie is as good as you think it, like, because I have it. It just never grasped me that way. That doesn't make, but whatever. Like I wasn't gonna go online and go and say, you know what, it sucks. I don't care what you're saying. You know, like what's the point? You know, that's like I said before.
Right. Or like, for example, like their defense was, come on, we're having a discussion. Isn't that the whole point of this thing? And I'm thinking, except it's not first of all, no, it's not. And also, even if it was, you didn't discuss anything. What you did was the equivalent of seeing someone's nice mural and just walking by and spray painting on it. I mean, that's obviously an extreme example. But the point is, you didn't bring up any points. You only expressed your opinion. You didn't make a case. I had linked an article specifically for the purpose of saying this essay lays out all of these different arguments that I agree with, and that's my whole point in sharing it. And for you to, probably not having even read the article, just say, nope, it sucked. That's not a discussion.
No.
Even if I had invited discussion, that's not a discussion. And, okay. So now, apparently, this episode of the show is just about things that irritate me. So, I mean, I guess we talked about Pokemon Go a little bit.
Well, it doesn't. Let's talk about some other things. So, 2 TV shows that I'm watching now are The Night Of. Oh, yeah? Mm-hmm. Which I think fits right into some of what we've been discussing in that, it's nuanced. It is not the greatest show that has ever come on TV. Mm-hmm. It has some issues, but it has gained some traction, and it has my interest. And I am not watching simply because it's the next thing to watch, or like I have to feel like I watched the next episode, which is kind of how I felt after the first one. Mm-hmm. I was like, I guess I'll watch the second one because I watched the first one, and it didn't grab me at the beginning. But it's gained a little bit of traction. I've got a little bit of interest. I'm curious as to the resolution, and that makes for an entertaining hour once a week. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to say it's the next Game of Thrones. I mean, it isn't. It's
not aiming for that, though, right? I mean, this is a limited. It's from inception. It's a limited series. It's like a mini series, right? Yeah. I don't think they're ever planning to do a season 2 of it. It was always intended to be just a one and done type of thing.
Right. I feel like if they did a season 2, it would be similar to like how True Detective is, and it would just be like a new case. It'd be a new thing. They would skin it with the same title, but it would be a whole entire new.
Right. Hopefully, it would be more successful than True Detective season 2 was.
Yes.
I've been watching The Night Of as well. I find it very engaging as well, but with some elements that just feel like, why are we spending so much time on this piece? I'm thinking mostly of John Turturro's medical issues. I feel like we're spending a lot of screen time on that.
And unless it comes into play in the case somehow, which I don't think it does. Like, the character building I get, but we got the point. Like he's kind of a sloppy, weird dude, and like he's not a slick lawyer, and that and that's important to his character. It's very important to his character.
Right. But we get it after a point.
Get it. Yeah. The pacing is interesting. I think that was part of what picked up steam with me after the first episode. Like, I think, especially with the way what happened in the first episode, with it being like all of the events, the way that it was edited and timed, which I feel like the rest of the season still has that same pacing.
Yeah. Anyone who is not. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but just anyone who is unfamiliar entirely with the show, it's basically it's all framed around.
Do that. I'm gonna do that. I'm just gonna go.
It's a murder trial where we don't know the outcome. So we follow the attorneys, we follow the suspect as he's been arrested and put in prison. We follow his family and how their lives are affected by him being on trial, and following the case and all of that sort of thing. So that's what the show is. But the show has very deliberately left us in the dark as to whether or not the suspect is guilty. We might have our opinions, but the show has not been definitive either way.
No, and they're clearly taking
some
direction from the Serial podcast. Like, it's not identical, but the thematic thing is the same in that, you know, it seems really obvious that this guy did it, but there are these just weird things about it. And these lingering other people and situations that keep coming up.
Yeah,
but
the circumstantial evidence is very strong.
Right.
But there are just pieces of it that don't seem right. And so a lot of the show is having us kind of go back and forth on, is the answer to that it's like, well, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy who would do it. But then we get clues to some other things he's done in the past. Like, oh, well, I don't know, maybe there's something there after all, you know?
And things he's doing presently, like, for example, he shaves his head, starts smoking crack, and tattoos his hands. Like, that's not a thing that, like, a normal good kid does. Like, there's something... Right. And you're like, oh, well, is that just being wrongfully imprisoned? Or is he kind of a weird dude?
Yeah, know? Yeah. I will just give a shout out to the idea that he's Pakistani, and so Sinbad the Sailor is a folklore character that he expresses admiration for. But the way that he has that tattooed on his hand, so it's Sinbad together, but then sin and bad, Sinbad, and I was just like, that's really actually very clever. It doesn't really look good, but it's just. I was really impressed though that just the kind of the dual nature of that tattoo.
Right, and that's why it's great. It's really clever, and from his perspective, you could see why he would think it was really clever.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when you're trying to go fight that you are this good kid who got wrapped up in a situation that you had nothing to do with, and you're getting prison tats on your fingers, probably not the right thing to be doing.
Right, but the flip side, you know, the other side of the argument is if he is perceived as the good kid who wouldn't hurt anybody, and yet he's there in prison for raping and killing a young woman, it's the sort of thing that would and does get him in trouble. People who want to hurt him just to kind of look tough themselves. And so he feels like in order to survive, he needs to look tougher.
Yes. And that's why I said I think it really picked up some steam in that the pacing kind of, as the plot developed and they had these really great dichotomies with everybody, and you know, and no one is exactly as they seem. Like they're like, it makes them very real. Yeah, you know, the girl that is killed is like that. Her stepfather is like that. Our main character is like that. You know, his father and his partners have these other issues. His mom doesn't believe him and thinks that she raised a monster, but yet she still wants to support him because she's the mom. Like there's all these, there's a whole dual nature to everybody in there that where you can understand why his mom would be mad at him because and mad that she raised this monster, because the overwhelming evidence is that he did do this. But you're kind of mad at her too, because you're like, but wait, we don't know that he did it, and you're his mom. Like, you should be believing him. But you understand why she doesn't believe him. And just like you said with him, you understand why he would behave that way when he's in prison, even though you're like, no, you shouldn't be doing that. You're on trial, and they're trying to say you're a good guy, but you're not looking like a good guy. And you know, so the whole so the pacing that was off in that first episode started to really hit as it got through, and you were like being drawn through these different ways that these characters like maneuver through the show, and so I really do like it, and I think there are some issues with it, and that's why I said it was a great segue or whatever when you were talking about, because it is nuanced. I could see why you couldn't get into it after the first episode. It was that first episode just didn't fire right.
Well, the first episode is almost like a prologue to the rest of the show, because the rest of the show is all about dealing with the fallout of this crime, whereas the first episode is the night of. It is what this character is doing that night leading up to where he finds himself in this situation, but with a, critical drug-induced gap where we are not allowed to see what happened in that period, and that's of course that's the period that matters.
And they deliberately have to show it in segment because that's how the rest of the show is going to treat the night of. Is they're going to look at these different incidents that happened. And so the parts where the drug-induced part, or where they're alone and there's no corroboration, are very vague. And it's a weird way to watch a first episode when you're watching an event and you're kind of left with all these pieces. But now looking back, like, it almost makes the rest of it make more sense because you're looking back at the night of in a fragmented way. So you sort of join the characters later on. So, and as you said, there were some strange things that it seems to take too long with. I'm nervous the resolution is going to be too fast because there is only one episode left and there are a lot of hanging chads out there that maybe it's going to play it like Serial where it just like leaves them, which
honestly, yeah. Well, and see, Serial was hamstrung by the virtue of the fact that they're dealing with a real life case and therefore can't control whether or not there's actual resolution or not, versus a fictional story where they are fully able to just decide whether he did it or not. And
and all of these pieces mean, and I think that's the problem with Serial is, for me, it wasn't even just whether he did it or not at the end. It's like you introduced all of these like vague things and like, oh, well, there's this guy and what's his deal? Like he was involved, he was around and he was cleaning up trash there. And there was this guy who had this motive and it's all just like, well, shit, don't know anything.
Yeah. So so I've been watching and enjoying, but at the same time, there's a lot of, the show's writing a lot of IOUs. That it's going to have to pay off with the finale, and if it fails to do so, it will retroactively make me dislike the show.
Exactly.
And so if it succeeds and has a payoff that's satisfying, I will be very happy with the show. I am worried about that because I could totally see this show, even if it gives us an answer in the trial, in the sense of a conviction or an acquittal, I could see the show never resolving it for us, the viewer, definitively whether or not he did it, and I'll be irritated. And I get it, but that's not the sort of show that I was feeling like I wanted to watch. You know what I mean? It's like I was interested in a mystery, and I wanted to see it solved. And yes, I get in real life, sometimes you really just don't know. And it's like, okay, yeah, but that doesn't mean that's why I wanted to spend 8 hours watching the show.
Right. And that's my fear too, is that they'll, it'll be something like they'll convict him, but there will still be all of these doubts and they'll be like, well, sometimes shit just happens and you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I could feel them doing that and me hating that. But if they tie it all up, the other thing I could see is them resolving part of it and then just not addressing all of these other, like, I feel like they've got to wrap up all of their loose ends to really satisfy me. And I know that's not.
Well, honestly, my biggest nitpick is that there is one evidential circumstance that it just leapt right out at me, seeming like it should be super obvious as a question, and the show is just treating it like it's a non-issue, like not even addressed and dismissed, but just like not even asking. And that is, there is blood all over the freaking place in that crime scene, and he's got a little bit of blood on his hand from his own cut, and that's it. Why is that not? Why would, like, if he did it, shouldn't he be just like covered in blood? And maybe there's an answer, but the show hasn't even asked the question. And that's been bugging me because that seems like an obvious thing for the defense to raise.
Yes.
Because we see the crime scene a bunch and there's blood sprayed everywhere. The idea that it's like maybe he was naked when the crime happened, and so it wouldn't be on his clothes. But then what? He took a shower? And
yeah,
then he's still all. Yeah, like there's just elements where like the shower's not built into their timeline. Wouldn't he have maybe taken some time if he cut his hand when that happened? Wouldn't maybe he would have taken some time to treat his hand so that it was not actively bleeding on the corridor when they picked him up later? Not to mention that they said he smelled like alcohol and that's why they thought he was drunk. But if he had just taken a shower, I'm irritated because it seemed obvious to me from the very first episode, or at least when they picked him up. I'm trying to remember if that happened.
That happened in the first episode, yeah.
Yeah, so that seemed obvious to me as soon as we saw the crime scene, and yet it would be one thing if the show kind of raised that and then said, here's why that isn't definitive either way. I would be willing to accept that, but it feels like they just didn't even ask the question, which seems like such a striking oversight that either they're saving it up to be the smoking gun at the end, which will also be irritating because it shouldn't work like that, or it's just not going to get addressed at all, which seems weird. So that's another nitpick.
I feel like it's not, and some of the, I don't pretend to be a lawyer by any means, but I've watched enough law movies and Law and Order and all that. Mm-hmm. There's some stuff in the courtroom things that are just absurd. Like the expert comes on and they said, oh, so he had this cut on his hand. Where did that come from? Well, that happened when his hand slid down the knife. Like, I mean, if that's not just speculation, like you can object to that like that. I know that. Mm-hmm. Like you can't say that is definitive.
Yeah.
You can say objection, speculation, and they say sustained, So they got it out there that the guy said that is likely from, basically said that's from him stabbing her and the knife slipping. Mm-hmm. But it is also not part of the court record because you can't say that. You weren't there. You can't just say that's how it happened.
Right. Well, and not only that, but in the context of the show. Yeah, I mean, so there's other elements that we know as viewers of the show, too, is that, first of all, we saw him cut his hand, and that's not how it happened.
Right. So for the guy to say that's how it happened, yeah.
So not only do we know for a fact that that's not what happened, but we also saw a scene where the district attorney went to him and basically went, so if I show you this picture in court, do you think you could be able to say definitively that it was the knife that did it? And he's like, maybe. And she's like, let me ask you again. Do you think you will be definitively able to say that it was the knife? Wink, wink. And he's like, oh, yeah, totally. And then, of course, he goes in and says, yep, it was the knife. And it's like, okay. I mean, I guess we can understand why that would happen, but it doesn't make it okay.
No, and it's not legally permissible like that. That is a pure speculation, and they can object to that. And
yeah, well, and they do.
They
cross-examine.
They cross-examine it and prove it incorrect. But the fact that what just was left and not objected, so there's little things like that. That's why I said it's nuanced in that there are some things that bug me about it, but I am enjoying.
Yeah, the show is very well produced, and there's a lot of good writing in there generally, other than these nitpicks that we're raising. But as we also kind of agreed earlier, a lot of what we've been enjoying up till now is kind of predicated on the expectation of getting a payoff at the end. And if we don't, then
there's a lot of payoff.
There's a lot of spinning plates that are going to crash to the ground if they don't manage to land this thing.
Yes.
So
everything from what his situation is inside prison and his relationships in there, his family relationships, the different suspects, the different people who aren't necessarily even suspects but interacted with them that night. There's just all these things that you feel like it all has to come, together somehow. The fact they keep zooming in on the friggin' deer head, does that mean anything, or is it just to show she has a deer head? Is it scene setting, or is it
creepy image that they just
Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a lot of stuff like that. Like, and there are loose ends that I wouldn't mind being left loose if we are still given a definitive answer. Like, for example, if what we are told is guy A definitely did it, then I don't really care that B and C were also reasonable suspects at some point and we didn't ever get a definitive alibi from them. That would be okay as long as we have a definitive answer. What will irritate me is, whoop, but guess what? That's like real life. And I'm like, yeah, so I could watch real life for that instead of an HBO show.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that. Another show that that we've just started, which I know is a little bit older, is Mr. Robot.
Oh, I'm surprised because I just watched the first 3 episodes of that earlier today.
The first 3 episodes of the season?
Mr. Robot. Yeah, of season 1.
Series?
Yeah.
Oh, me too. Yeah, I mean, not today, but we watched them this week. And we were actually also 3 episodes in.
That is so funny.
That is funny. I figured you would have already have seen that. It just seemed...
Well, I heard about it, and I heard that it was good, and I watched the first episode back when it was new, and I just kind of fell off of it, like, at the time. Like, I watched the first episode when it was new and said, yeah, that looks good, and then just didn't come back for reasons that there's no real reason. But yeah, I noticed it was on Amazon Prime for free, so video, today when I was looking there for something else, and I said, oh, look, Mr. Robot, that's good, isn't it? I've heard people say so.
Yeah, and that's what it came down to. Like, we were sitting here and we're like, what are some new shows we could get into? Because we're caught up on House of Cards, we're all that. And I knew of 2 that I was interested in. One was Stranger Things.
Mm-hmm. Stranger Things is good.
I like Stranger Things. I was not a big fan of the first episode because it was kind of scary, even though it's not like horror scary. Like, that's just not her thing. Like, the sci-fi, like, she just wasn't feeling it. I was loving it. It was like, it's an 80s show. It looks like it was filmed in the 80s. Like, it's perfect. And she's like, nah. What's the other one? I was like, Mr. Robot. She's like, let's try that one. So we watched Mr. Robot episode 1. She's like, yeah, this is the one we're going to watch.
Well, yeah.
Which is fine. I mean, that's part of the fun. I mean, I want to watch shows that she likes, and so that we can hang out. So yeah, we watched the first 3 episodes, and I'm digging it.
Mm-hmm.
It's why it's popular. And,
yeah, totally. I mean, it's very smart. It's very stylish. It's got some great aesthetics to it. It's got a fun kind of... I was starting to call him an anti-hero character, but I don't even think that's really true. It's more... Because, like, he's a straight-up good guy. Just his... Like, part of his whole thing is that his moral compass, meaning what he thinks of as good versus what he thinks of as bad, is askew with the rest of society. But within his own personal moral compass, he absolutely might as well be a superhero out of a comic book. He is saving people at his own personal risk just constantly. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting in the context that the rest of the society wouldn't necessarily see what he's doing as heroic necessarily. But he, within his own personal headspace, it absolutely is. And so at the same time that he's doing that, he definitely has his own quirks, his morphine addiction and willingness to go outside the law. But yeah.
Has a quirk in and of itself. Like, I love the fact that he gets when he gets morphine, he also gets the withdrawal drugs. Like, so he's not like a heroin addict, he's just taking these morphine pills, but then he will start taking the withdrawals immediately with it. Like, like the idiosyncrasy that comes along with how he takes morphine is almost amusing,
It's a metaphor for his competing drive. What I talked earlier about competing drives, but this idea of wanting to be in control of everything, and yet also part of himself rebelling from the feeling of being controlled. And because he's got some issues with delusion, he's not even necessarily a reliable narrator for himself. And that's addressed straight up in the first episode, where he pretty much tells us, the viewer, that we are a made-up character in his head. So the voiceover is him talking to an imaginary character in his head as he is addressing us telling the story.
Yeah, that's why I love when, he uses, which is a thing that I love about House of Cards too, when they break the wall and they actually speak to the audience.
Yeah.
I think you were the one that pointed out to me it's a little aside, but one of the most epic moments in House of Cards is the season where he doesn't actually address us for the entire first episode.
That season 2 is where that happens.
And then he looks over and goes, "I bet you thought I forgot about you."
Yeah, that was pretty good.
So epic. I mean, epic. But yeah, that setup allows him to do the same thing, just in a different, but with a different feel to it. With House of Cards, like, it makes sense because it has to do with, like, he's showing us, like, how good he is at what he's doing. Like, there's like an arrogance that comes with, I don't even have to follow the rules of the TV show because I am manipulating everything.
Yeah.
Like, it feels right with that. When in Mr. Robot, and it feels part of his delusion. So it's the same exact technique, but tells the story differently. And I really dig it. I liked it a lot. And I love that every time when, like, randomly, like, the people in the black suits are caught up in something, and someone else is there. It's like, him too. You just kind of.
Well, it's because like, there are definitely. There are some times where we're thinking we're not sure if they're really there or not. But then there are some other times where no, like these two guys in black suits are absolutely real, and they make him get in a car and they take him to a real person where he talks to other people. So those two guys were absolutely real. But what about the guys that were outside the subway train? And another element of setting us up to understand and expect that Elliot, the main character, is not necessarily a reliable narrator is him pointing out that this company he works for, which is called E Corp, he just in his head, and tells us this, that he just has decided in his head he thinks of it as Evil Corp, to the point where his brain just fills it in. And so from that point on, anytime anybody says the name of the corporation, they say Evil Corp. And when we see it on screen, it says Evil. But he has told us it's not really Evil Corp from an objective perspective. It's that he thinks of them that way, to the point where he just sort of mentally fills it in, whether people say it that way or not.
Yeah. And I love the bad guy. the corporate, the evil core, like, guy who's trying to be the CTO. Just, like, they have embodied, like, they just made him so hyper corporate ladder climbing to a point that's not even real.
Yeah.
Like,
there's a little bit of an American Psycho flavor there.
Yes. I love it because, he's willing, like, when he has the, like, gay relationship with the receptionist to, like, gain information, and you're, like, not even sure if, like, well, is he really gay and he just has the wife because that's what he's supposed to have? Or does he love his wife and he's just being gay with this dude because he needs the information? Like, it's kind of, it's very ambiguous. And
it's like maybe all of his relationships are just constituted on what he can get out of them.
What he can get out of them, right? And that's exactly how you feel. And you're, like, kind of creeped out by the whole thing, not just because he, like, had this gay relationship, but you're just, the whole way he treats things, you're like, it's scary. Like,
well, like, even just our first introduction to that character is interesting because we have just had Elliot observe that the present CTO is an idiot who doesn't really know anything about technology and kind of dismissive. But then this gaggle of executives walking through the office, this guy that we're talking about kind of hangs back. And just as Elliot was preparing to dismiss him like he did all of the other executives, the guy reveals, oh, wait, no, he does actually know what he's talking about. He said he makes an intelligent comment about like, oh, you're using this user environment rather than that one. I still use this Linux environment, and I know it's probably not the most efficient, but old habits. And it's really obvious that he knows exactly what he's talking about, and yet there is a creepy kind of suspicious vibe, like this guy somehow knows what's really going on. And would not be okay with it. And there's this sort of just creepy element. And it goes to the point where Elliot, in his voiceover, says, wait a minute, what's this guy talking about Linux for? An executive with Linux? And then the guy interrupts the voiceover to say, now I know what you're thinking. An executive running Linux? And we're like, oh, that's unsettling.
Then there's the other piece where when Elliot makes his decision to frame based on what F Society and Christian Slater's character wants done, the current CTO, and he swaps these data files. And this guy notices that, doesn't say anything, just kind of processes it, and uses it as a reason to offer him a job. Because he knows he sees him as also ruthless. That's what he interprets from that. It's not like, and that's what you get out of it. It's not just his talent that he wants to hire him for a job. He saw him make a decision to throw somebody under the bus and says that's a climber. When what Elliot's really trying to do is actually gain favor with this, like we talked about, the groups.
Well, so under the whole
there's the anti-group that he wants to gain favor with. So he chooses to do what they tell him to do so he can be part of that group. And yet the big group guy thinks he's a ladder climber, so he wants to bring him in. The whole way it all flows is awesome. Yeah.
Well, and then how almost immediately even this little cool TV show friendly clan of secret hackers that want to take down, the evil corporations and all of that sort of thing are almost immediately resolved as very amoral themselves, and it's not at all clear that their motives are even good. It's like much less the ends justify the means, but it's like we're not even sure we like the ends that they want.
Right, like they're cyber terrorists, but they're not like fun hackers. Like they're true cyber terrorists. Like they're trying to cause actual harm and problems and terror.
Yeah. Well, it's like if Elliot thinks of himself as Robin Hood, and then he finds this group and he says, hey, excellent, these can be the merry men. And then he realizes like, oh no, they're just bandits.
Yeah.
But now he's kind of stuck involved with them in a way that's not easy to extricate himself. And it's also not clear that we really even understand the bigger picture. In fact, it seems very clear that we don't understand the bigger picture. But that's very cool. I mean, I like it so far.
Yeah, it's got a fun style. It has a different feel and pace to it, like that. It just kind of clicks along. It's really fun to watch. They are huge fans of the cliffhanger to the point like I don't want to say too much because it's not, but
when we're only a couple of episodes in, it's hard to judge that.
Of the first 3 episodes, though, they are very over the top with their cliffhangers.
Yeah, it's a very binge-friendly show in that way. You want to just start the next episode right away.
Oh my God, you got pushed off the pier! Like, yeah. I mean, it's just like that kind of stuff. Like, it feels like, is that actually necessary to the story for him to shove him off the pier? No.
Well, what I think it does, though, that's just interesting is it just continues to really highlight this idea that we really don't know these people. We don't know what they're like or what they want or what they'll do. And they are unpredictable in a way that is dangerous.
Yeah, that's a good description of it. But you could have done that without the just cliffhanger of like, oh my God, he pushed him off the pier right after he talked about his dad dying. Like, that was done for effect.
Well, yeah,
and
I mean, for sure.
Not just to make the point that, yes, the point you're making was done with that, but that wasn't why they did it. And I don't find it a fault. It's just part of this. It's part of the show is that they've decided, at least in the early episodes, and I haven't seen the whole season, to really drum up the cliffhangers. Mm-hmm. But again, this was a show that was originally shown on, was originally televised.
Yeah, USA.
Right. It wasn't designed to be just an online show. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, but they're smart in that they understand that that's how a lot of people are going to be watching it. They're the whole long tail of it. The idea that's how. Yeah.
It works on an episodic show. If you throw this huge cliffhanger on a Monday night and it doesn't come on until the next Monday, like people are now anticipating it, and you're guaranteed to get the viewers to continue.
Right.
And it was like what you're about to describe with the understanding the binge mentality.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's how they build their audience from season to season too, right? Because if you have people who have been watching it live and they're back, but now you have to have given the people who didn't watch it originally a way to get caught up, right? So that you want to make sure that if people start watching, that they keep watching. And in fact, I think that may have been part of what happened with me in the first place. Is I watched the first episode and I was interested, but I guess I hadn't set it up to record the series, and then I kind of just forgot. And then I realized at some point, oh wait, I didn't ever get those, but now I've missed one, and oh well, never mind. I'm watching other things. But with binging, it's like, oh yeah, it's all right there, and it's just going to automatically play the next one without me even having to press a button.
Yep.
Although sometimes I press the button because I don't want to wait 28 seconds or whatever it comes up with when it starts saying the next episode will play in. Yeah. Just as a brief insert, I had posted on Twitter when we started the show to see if anyone had requested topics, and Cliff Lowe posted on Facebook. He said, you could talk about how the Mars rover is being deliberately kept in the rural areas of Mars and not in the cities.
That's funny.
It just makes me think of that recent kind of discovery, though, that they think that there is an Earth-like planet in the habitable zone of literally the very closest star to ours, which is kind of exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't mean to necessarily cut us off if you had more about Mr. Robot, but.
No, those were my stuffs.
Okay.
I've been watching those shows and been idling in Pokemon Go, but I'm also, like I said, just curious about the phenomena. So yeah. Sure.
Well, I will. Something that I've been thinking about and watching a lot of recently is CISO, which is like a web streaming content thing like Hulu. It's a SEESO, but it's I think it's owned by NBC, but it's the one. It's focused on comedy stuff. So what they have is they have a lot of archived classic comedy shows like Monty Python's Flying Circus and all the movies and The Kids in the Hall and Fawlty Towers and a lot of that classic comedy TV. Saturday Night Live, and then you can watch like all the late night shows. You can watch them like the next day streaming, but then they also have a lot of original shows, and the whole thing is just $4 a month, and you can get the first month for free. And I have way gotten more than $4 a month worth of use out of it over the course of the last month. I think a lot of their original shows are really good, and I think it's actually really worth the money. Some of the shows that I've watched on it so far are Harmon Quest, which is Dan Harmon is the creator of Community and Rick and Morty. And this is a show where he and some of his buddies play like a D&D type game, like live on a stage. But the show cuts in between that and an animated cartoon version of the adventure that they're having. So it kind of just cuts back and forth, just based on, you know, what they want to show in that moment. But it's really funny, and I liked that a lot. Then there's a show called Take My Wife, which is just a 6 half-hour run of a show where it stars Cameron Esposito and Rhea Butcher, who are both stand-up comics, and they are married to each other. And and so it's a show that is like based on their real life. So they're playing like slightly fictionalized versions of their real selves at a period earlier in their careers. But it's just really good. It's funny and kind of sweet, and you know, kind of talks about like the behind the scenes of this stand-up comic lifestyle, and also just this, you know, lesbian couple making their way in the world sort of thing, which seems like it, you know, like it, you could imagine it being like cheesy or preachy or something, but these are two very funny ladies talking about all sorts of fun stuff at the same time as kind of having some actual character drama in there too. I really liked it, is the point. And I feel like the more I describe it, the less entertaining it sounds, but I thought it was really good.
No, I'm kind of like, while you're talking, I'm sort of scrolling through the Twitter feed and kind of looking at what yeah.
Okay. And then there's a show with Jonah Ray called Hidden America, which is a little bit like an Anthony Bourdain No Reservations type of travel show, except that it's like fake, meaning he's going to real places, but the people he talks to aren't real. So like he goes to Boston and talks to a genealogy specialist to find out about, like, you know, some of his relatives that used to live in Boston back in the 1700s. And they basically point out that's like, oh yeah, you know, here's your ancestor, Josiah, who turns out he presided over more witch burnings than any other person. And he's like, oh, what? So they were real witches though, right? And he's like, there were no real witches. It's like, well, he thought they were. Actually, it shows in the transcript that there were lots of times they were just, you know, women who wouldn't sleep with him, and you know, or women he thought were ugly. And so it's just like the deeper he gives, the worse it gets. And then he talks to, in Chicago, some guys that, you know, he's trying to get into how intense they are into sports there, and basically what he discovers is that these guys are actually way more into beating up fans of other sports teams than the actual sports. Like they could care less about the actual games or whatever, but what they like is sort of the gang violence element of fighting with other teams' fans. And it's like with a lot of comedy, the more I explain this stuff, I feel like it loses in translation. The short version is, though, that I think that there's a lot of great stuff on there, and I feel like I'm a commercial every time I talk about it, but I'm enthusiastic.
No, I'm kind of, like I said, while you were talking, I was sort of scrolling through their Twitter feed and like looking at what they got on there, and it actually looks really good.
Yeah, and like I said, you can get a first month free. And a lot of their original shows, they have the first episode for free on YouTube too. So if anyone wants to kind of check out some of those shows and get a sense of whether you'd like it or not, it's easy to do that for free. Like one of the ones that I think I'm probably going to watch next is called Bajillion Dollar Properties, which is kind of a parody of those real estate shows. But that's got a lot of comedians that I I know in it, but it seems like it's just kind of a parody of those reality real estate selling shows. I've watched the first one of that, and they have Adam Scott playing this like rock and roll star, where every time they meet with him to talk about selling his house, he's high, and he's very enthusiastic and overly friendly and very excited to be working with them. And then they'll schedule like an open house to bring someone through to look at the house. And when they show up, he'll be there, but now sober and not remember anything about wanting to sell his house and demand that everybody leave. And they go through this a couple of times. It keeps happening. Like they leave because he's demanding that they leave, and he's threatening to call the police. And then he'll show up high again and say, "So, come on, when are we going to get some people to look at my house?" Yeah, so I recommend people check that out. Some stuff I have going on that I've kind of already talked about in my 5 more minutes, but like sort of my biggest news recently is just the idea that I finally finished the serial that I was working on since January. So that was kind of an exciting accomplishment.
Esposito or whatever? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Phyllis Esposito, Interdimensional Private Eye. Yeah. So it ended up being 148,000 words, which is pretty long for a novel length. But it's not technically a novel. I mean, it was kind of not written in the normal novel structure anyway. But
right.
Yeah.
I mean, how many pages would that be in a typical novel?
It would be probably in like the 500, 600 range. Because generally novel, like the lower end of a novel would be 80,000 words. And so that if you read an 80,000 word novel, that would be kind of long enough for you to say that's a shorter novel, but definitely novel sized and not some other category of thing. Right. But then as you start getting into like 100,000, 110,000, that's a little meatier. And so we're not quite into like Harry Potter Book 7 or Game of Thrones territory, but you're getting closer to that. The actual number of pages depends on a lot of format things, but
of course, yeah.
Mm-hmm. How big the print is and so on. But yeah, so the short answer is that it is not as long as some, but probably longer than most published novels. But yeah, that was it was exciting, and in just the couple of days that there's passed since then, it feels weird shifting out of that routine. But I've very deliberately decided that I don't want to just throw away this routine I've built of doing something creative every day. So I've had to kind of set a new rule for myself, is that even I'm not writing a new installment of that story every day, but instead of having like a deliverable that I have to post on my website every single day, what it is I have to spend an hour on some creative work, whatever it might be. But like the new permission is that it can be whatever I want it to be, as long as it's productive in some way. So like today I worked on editing a draft of a short story that I had previously written.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was kind of an exciting accomplishment. I don't know what else I have to say about it right now necessarily, but that was kind of the biggest thing for me recently.
And that was all purely just to write it, right? There was no income involved, correct?
Oh yeah, like no, definitely no. I mean, what I might try to I've been thinking about what I might do with the story now that it's written, but there was certainly nothing coming in as I wrote it. And it was really, the whole thing was just inspired by the idea of wanting to, like, I had gotten out of the habit of writing, and I hadn't been making much headway on anything. And so I specifically said, I'm kind of interested in the idea of serialized fiction, and I want to get back in the habit of writing more regularly, and I've had good luck in the past with doing things every day, so let's just try it. And that's what I did. And so I had no idea where the story was going to go or how long it would take or whether I might just give up when I started. But, I didn't give up. And, 8 months later, 237 episodes later, it finished. And I was very happy with the result, ultimately, given the way I wrote it.
You wrote a 600-page novel in 8 months is, even if you just look at it from that global perspective, like, that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, and the thing is, too, is like certainly there are people who write way more than that, but I'm also, I'm doing it while working a full-time other job, and this is completely in my spare time with no income associated with it.
Exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, it's good though. It felt good to set a goal for myself and then achieve it.
Yes, it always does feel good to do that. So,
well, so we seem to be trailing off a little bit, so maybe time to bring this episode of talking about stuff to a close. But
I think so. We've talked about some stuff.
We sure did, and so we will talk about more stuff in the future at some point, among our other various things, and then of course, as we said, talking about Survivor will come back in September.
Yep.
All right. So thank you everybody for listening and or watching, and we'll talk to you again another time.
Yep.